Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the core of everything. Today we have Dr. Jacob Anderson on the podcast. Jacob is a postdoctoral researcher here at the Lamont Doherty Observatory at Columbia University. His research focuses on the ice sheets and permafrost of Antarctica and Greenland. If you haven't already, check out his Instagram page, which is JTH Anderson, for his latest field trip videos. I'll add the link in the description. Our episode today includes many different topics, including how frozen ground, when melted, might release carbon into the atmosphere, how DNA, environmental DNA, can be preserved in ice, giving us a clue for the past environments over the previous 2 million years. And lastly, we talk about the melting of ice and how the melting of permafrost can release harmful bacteria, which might release a global virus on an unmanageable scale. Find out all this and more in our episode and enjoy the podcast. Thanks for LinkedIn, by the way.
Oh yeah, no,
I appreciate that.
it's good to connect.
It is good to connect. I'm just checking the cameras recording.
Well, I thought your technique was slightly unusual because you went for the follow, but you didn't go for the full connection.
I think I was on the bus at the time.
Yeah.
So I think I followed, but then lost connection.
So
I
you
was
couldn't connect,
and then I completely forgot.
You were disconnected.
Yeah, ironically.
Yeah.
I can endorse your skills now.
Yeah. I
Teamwork,
I haven't
leadership.
had those skills endorsed for like 10 years. You know when people first got LinkedIn and then like that was a thing, and then I feel like the skills thing just kind of got parked, and now it's just glorified social media but professional.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, but it's sort of embarrassing when you see like people post like what like it was the Euros recently with England. Jude Bellingham scores an overhead kick, and the next day on LinkedIn, what does Jude Bellingham's overhead kick tell us about performance in the workplace? It's like, come on, lad, come on, that's like
LinkedIn is just an extension of social media now. It's not any more professional than anything else, I reckon.
No.
Which is kind of like hilarious. But then I guess the problem is the other apps have just become full of so much noise and AI and fake news and bots that I guess...
I don't know, yeah. I don't know.
I
don't really use LinkedIn that much.
I'm trying to step back from everything.
Right. Yeah. Except for Instagram.
It's so addictive.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
You can't put it down.
Doom scrolling, isn't it?
Yeah.
Obviously, you've recently just done a load of posts on Instagram, though. Because you've just been in Greenland on a field trip.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, it's good to share the adventures. I like to share the adventures, you know. That's fun.
And educate the public.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's like all this work is paid for by taxpayers, so I think it's important that the public gets a better understanding about what we're doing. I think that's helpful, and I think it's interesting, and I think people are curious and they want to know about it, so it's great to share that.
Well, and also people wouldn't know they're interested until it's shared, because how often do people hear about permafrost on a daily basis?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because I would often forget, because I think about polar ice sheets or permafrost or these things all the time, and then you kind of forget that most people never think about these topics.
No.
Ever. And like every day my brain is like, what's this? It's like my brain is in a completely different place.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Because, if you're scrolling and you go, permafrost, and everyone's like, what on earth are you talking about,
Yeah. Permanently frozen ground. So the real definition is it's had to have been frozen for at least 2 consecutive years. That's the definition of permafrost.
Okay.
So it has to survive at least one summer thaw.
And it's frozen, it's ice between soil and sediment.
So permafrost varies. Some of it could be like 99% sand, but within those sand grains you have ice and it's frozen solid. Some of it may have a much higher ice content. So some of it you could almost get it to like dirty ice. So then if it's in the ground rather than glacier ice and it's dirty, then it's considered permafrost. But then, of course, you could have dead ice, which is like a remnant of a glacier that's been buried,
Right.
which wouldn't probably be permafrost. It would be buried ice. But now we're getting into the weeds.
Oh yeah, let's stay above the ground.
Yeah.
And
Well,
talk about,
we're below the ground, actually.
well, let's talk. Okay, yeah. In a metaphorical sense.
Yes.
Yeah. No, but seriously, we're above the ground. And so your PhD focused on permafrost and its role in the carbon cycle.
So not so much the carbon cycle, but more around how we can use permafrost as a tool to reconstruct past climate.
Okay.
So I've worked with the Italians on carbon cycle work, but that was largely driven by Italian projects. But my PhD was more around can we use permafrost as a tool to reconstruct paleoclimate or past environmental change?
Okay. Can you?
Well, yeah. The short answer is yes. Permafrost has a lot of potential, and I think a lot of people have not necessarily focused on permafrost because sometimes it doesn't have those nice long clean records like other deposits do, but I think there's a lot of potential, and in some cases it takes us further back in time. So the ice sheets, the records of the ice only go back 800,000 years. So
Right.
permafrost is several million years old, so it allows us to go back further in time where we don't have records from ice.
Okay. So what we're talking about here is a correlation between ice sheets and permafrost, right? So you've got both of which are involving frozen water. And ice sheets, I guess, when you hear on the news of ice sheets melting, people just think things are heating up, therefore ice is melting. But there's multiple mechanisms in which ice sheets can melt, whether it's atmospheric warming or there's sort of percolating warm waters beneath the ice sheet, if I'm right. I guess these mechanisms are kind of difficult to quantify which one's more important, or at least the amount of ice loss. So how is permafrost important to understanding that ice loss with ice sheets?
Yeah, so in Antarctica, the West Antarctic ice sheet is largely grounded below sea level. So that ice sits on the bed below sea level. So it's vulnerable to water from the ocean, warm water coming up onto the continental shelf and melting it from the bottom up. So the West Antarctic is vulnerable from ocean warming, whereas the East Antarctic is largely sitting above sea level. So it's still sitting on rock, but above sea level, so it's not as vulnerable to ocean warming, but it is still sensitive to atmospheric warming or top-down melt. But Antarctica currently is cold enough that it hasn't been sufficiently warm to see top-down melt recently. Whereas in Greenland, where you see these kind of rivers flowing off parts of Greenland, it has the temperatures are above zero. It has gotten warm enough to melt from the top down. So Greenland is a bit like a future analogue for what Antarctica could look like if temperatures continue to increase in the atmosphere. So where permafrost is really valuable is we can look at the permafrost and see if there's any past signatures of previous atmospheric warming or atmospheric or surface melt. So really what we're trying to do when we look at permafrost is try and understand whether or not that permafrost is stable and has been frozen for a long period of time, or if it's showing any indication of surface melt and then perhaps atmospheric warming that could enable Antarctica, the East Antarctic ice sheet, to melt from the top down.
Okay.
And so the concern is because the East Antarctic contains a huge amount of ice, about 50 meters of sea level equivalent, whereas the West Antarctic is about 4 meters. So while the West Antarctic is more immediately susceptible to melting, the East Antarctic is containing a much larger source of ice.
Okay, that makes sense to me. This is a bit off topic, but Fred Richards, we had him on the podcast, who's a doctor I think he's looking at isostatic rebound chiefly. But he talks about in Greenland how you've got this, as the ice sheet's melting, you've got this isostatic rebound, so the crust is just responding to the loss of mass on weighing it down. But you also have a gravity effect where the large ice sheets have a gravitational pull, and so when they melt, the pull which is correlated to mass, the pull of gravity is lowered, and actually there's a dip in the sea level around the ice sheet, whereas all the water is shifting towards the equator. Do we see something similar happening around Antarctica, or is this chiefly just in Greenland?
Yeah, no, any large body of ice, it's a similar process happens. So generally what happens in both polar regions, as you say, the ice retreats and then the crust kind of rebounds. So the sea level actually can lower in the polar regions, even if the rest of the world, in particular in the equators, we have this increase in sea level. You have this interesting record where there's marine terraces that are raised up in both polar regions because of this effect.
Cool. New Zealand's safe.
Well, New Zealand's sinking, so New
right.
Zealand's got other tectonic problems. Yes, it's a big challenge in parts of New Zealand because so if sea level was to say rise by 3 or 4 millimeters a year, which it is currently, and then you've also got this subsidence or this sinking of 3 or 4 millimeters a year, then you actually end up with about 6 or 8 millimeters of relative sea level change. So the rate is happening twice as fast.
I mean, are we seeing that in New Zealand? Are we seeing the change in the shape of the surface, sort of topography and stuff? Are we seeing that in New Zealand?
So yeah, in some of these parts of New Zealand, we are seeing the subsidence where you're seeing a doubling of sea level. But in other places, you've got uplift keeping up with the rate of sea level, and so sea level is effectively zero.
Okay.
Or perhaps a lowering if there's high enough uplift.
Okay. It's not just the tip of... Is it Mount Cook? Is that on New Zealand?
Yes.
Yeah, just the tip of that left over.
Yeah. I mean, so the uplift of that is incredible, but that's also eroding at this unbelievable pace. So that all of the sediment that's coming off the sides of the mountains.
Wow. Okay. I read a paper of yours in Geophysical Research Letters, where you're a co-author. It stated that the Northern Hemisphere studies show that the rate of permafrost thawing is increasing at an alarming rate. So frozen soil that traps something like carbon is releasing carbon back into the atmosphere. What does the data show in Antarctica? Is this like a global phenomenon there where you have this thawing permafrost and large release of carbon?
The Northern Hemisphere's got these enormous frozen bogs, and there's a huge amount of vegetation, and so when that thaws, the microbes basically come to life, and then they cause this huge amount of breakdown, which releases a lot of gases. So the Northern Hemisphere has this huge unlocked amount of greenhouse gas potential, and if that thaws, then you have this increased warming effect, which then causes more thawing, which increases the amount of greenhouse gas being released into the atmosphere. Antarctica doesn't have the same amount of vegetation frozen in the ground, but it does still have gases. And so our work was about mapping in the dry valleys, which is one of the largest ice-free parts of Antarctica, mapping the amount of CO2 and methane that was coming out of the ground. And what we found is there is an increase in greenhouse gases being released into the atmosphere, not at the same rate as the Northern Hemisphere, but there is an amount of gas that's being released, and that's currently not quantified in any kind of global climate models. And the real question is there more gas locked up in the subsurface, in these brine channels, or locked up under the ice? And if there is a mechanism or a pathway where that can be released, what does that look like? Those are kind of big questions that we don't really know yet.
It'd be interesting to quantify the release of carbon from permafrost relative to, or at least melting ice, relative to anthropogenic carbon emissions and see.
Yeah, it would still be in Antarctica, it would still be very small compared to the anthropogenic contribution. But in the Northern Hemisphere, it's very significant.
But it's almost a double-edged sword, right? Because you've got our emissions of greenhouse gases, which warms the planet, which then melts these permafrost, which releases more carbon, which, and it's just this big
so
cycle.
it's one of these tipping points, basically, and then once you've got this, runaway warming, then you increase the warming, which causes more warming, and until you get to kind of this new kind of level of stability at some point, perhaps.
Hopefully. You mentioned microbes. I'm really glad you did, because obviously microorganisms, Walt Disney, can be preserved in ice. Was it called cryopreservation or cryogenics or something, right?
Cryo is the Greek word for frozen. Anything frozen.
Cryo ice cream. Yeah. DNA has been sequenced from woolly mammoth from about a million years old, which has been preserved in ice, and it's believed now that it's possible not just to collect DNA from animal matter, but also from environmental DNA, so from soils and sediments. What's the current research like in that area? Because I'm not quite familiar with it.
So historically, it would have been cultures. So they would have taken a sample and then tried to grow, like on a petri dish, try and grow microorganisms back in a lab. Historically, this was how it was done. You could take something and then feed it and then grow it. Of course, when you culture things, you only can grow what might grow on the medium, which we know now is only a small fraction of the life in these extreme environments. But now there's all these new amazing molecular sequencing techniques that allow us to directly get environmental DNA from the environment and sequence it if it's good enough quality. Challenge in a place like Antarctica, where it's incredibly cold and there's extremely low biomass, so you've got contamination issues and you're dealing with these tiny fractions. It's really difficult to find enough material, so you've got to be very careful with both your decontamination protocols but also your ability to make sure you've got these really small fractions of DNA. And so now we've got a very good understanding around the surface soils in low elevation parts of the dry valleys, but there hasn't been as much work done in the subsurface, so in the permafrost. So that frozen ground, it's harder to access. It's very difficult. You've got to drill through it. So logistically, it's challenging to access these places. And historically, it was only really culturing work that had been done. So part of my PhD was looking at whether or not we could use ancient DNA preserved in permafrost as a tool to reconstruct past environmental conditions, which comes back to our question about the past environment. What did that look like?
Okay, for sure. Okay, makes sense to me.
So I mean, to put that into perspective, I guess if you think about a lake sediment core, and in that lake over time you're seeing leaves and pollen and other material blown into that lake, and then it settles on the seafloor, on the lake bed, and then over time, as the environment changes in that lake, the pollen changes and the environment around the lake changes, and so that record is preserved. And then if you take a core from that lake, you can directly look at how the environment has changed around that lake. In Antarctica, we don't have vegetation, or not currently. In the past there was, but over at least the last 5-6 million years, there hasn't been any vegetation in these low elevation areas. But we do have bacteria, and so we were trying to understand, could we use bacteria in a similar way that we use lake sediment cores to reconstruct environments in other parts of the world.
Okay. In terms of so that the nature of this DNA is environmental DNA is just remnants of sort of plant life. Is that right, or is it just?
So we're looking at just a bacteria.
Bacteria.
There is no plant. There's a cyanobacteria,
Right.
And there's a few mosses, but they don't last very long. So we're for the most part we're looking at the bacteria.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you mentioned bacteria, because it comes to the point where this bacteria that's trapped in ice, when the ice melts, this bacteria is released. Is there a chance that, this is going to be scaremongering, but is there a chance that the bacteria could be harmful to us and it's being released into the world, and it'll be something like I Am Legend, where we have this virus that will attack us?
So yeah, it's funny because somebody asked me that when I was working in the lab on this, and I'd never thought about it. I was like, oh, what, could something happen? And the answer is no.
Okay.
I mean,
okay. Good.
So I mean, yeah. Unfortunately, we don't have a great plot for a movie. In the northern hemisphere, though, that's not entirely true, because there is some historical diseases and things that were in the northern hemisphere that then froze and could potentially unfreeze, because humans have lived in these frozen regions. So that's not the case in parts of the northern hemisphere. But in Antarctica, there isn't any potential for viruses or things that could harm us, because we've never really lived in those places for any significant period of time where they could have frozen and then get released back into the environment. It's not to say that there isn't viruses in the permafrost. There is, and that's another really interesting piece of research that's only just really starting. We don't really know anything about the viruses that are in the permafrost, but they are there.
That's both exciting and terrifying, isn't it?
I mean, I think it's really cool.
Yeah.
But I'm excited to see where the people who are studying the viral communities, what they end up discovering.
Yeah, in prep for this, I read somewhere that in 2016 in Siberia, there were these frozen carcasses in the permafrost that when it started to melt, there was a huge exposure to a bacteria that's called like Bacillus anthracis or something like that, right? And there was an outbreak of anthrax simply because of these things that had been frozen in the permafrost that had then subsequently been, it's been melted and revealed.
I mean, I guess if it's some kind of frozen animal, it's not that different from leaving your freezer open.
Oh, that's true.
And the steak or whatever's in the freezer starts to go off. Like, it's kind of the same thing, right?
Yeah.
And so again, this happens in the northern hemisphere because we have these animals and this material and there's all this biological activity. Whereas it's too cold and too dry in Antarctica for this to happen.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. I was looking at a paper in 2017 in Quaternary Science Reviews, which you focused on Antarctic ice loss retreat in the Holocene, or at least since the last glacial maximum.
Yeah, since the last glacial period, yeah.
Yeah, and one of your findings was that in the mid-Holocene, ice loss was far higher than it was today, or at least highly significant. And obviously with what we hear about anthropogenic greenhouse gas emission, that I was surprised by that. How much more significant was it than present day? And what was the kind of cause of that ice loss? Is it volcanic activity, for example?
So I mean, that was largely orbital. So as we were coming out of the last ice age, that was the transition from going from a glacial period to an interglacial period. And so this happens over geological timescales. We see these kind of warm and cold periods, or ice ages and warm periods. And so we were coming out of an ice age going into a warm period, and
right.
In that process, that's when we see this melting of the ice sheets. And then as we come out of that, and the ice is subsequently retreated, then sea level starts to stabilize, and it's about that same time period, about 7,000 years ago, where the ice largely had retreated and sea levels were becoming more like they are today. This is also the period of time where we started to see modern civilization. So I think it was once the ice had retreated, climate stabilized. We've been living in this kind of 1 degree band for about the last 7,000 years, which is the advent of agriculture and all of the modern things that we have today. So I think there's a direct link between that time period and modern civilization. But now, of course, as we've taken all this fossil carbon out of the ground and burnt it, put it in the atmosphere, put it in the ocean, we're seeing this warming effect. And now we're starting to, we've warmed the planet by 1.1 degrees now. We're starting to move out of this 1 degree band. The question is, what does that mean as we start to adjust and start to live in this warmer world? What impacts will that have? Can we adapt? What other unforeseen challenges might we see? Like sea level rise, or if we're going to see permafrost thawing. So again, permafrost for these communities who live in the northern hemisphere, they're starting to see the houses moving because the land is moving as the permafrost thaws. So in some cases, you've got these houses that are kind of wobbling and kind of starting to really deform, which is obviously...
How so? Because the ground's responding
because
to ice
because the ground is partially frozen, and then as it thaws, it moves. So it's a sort of a cryotectonics, I guess.
Whoa.
Yeah.
That would only disturb the upper... how much of the ground would that disturb?
That would probably only the upper few meters. But if the house is built on frozen ground, then they're going to have to deal with that. So that's obviously a challenge for those communities. But more broadly, right, like we've got so much of our communities in coastal places.
Yeah.
Like look at what's happening in Florida with these recent storms and how many people that's displaced. And unfortunately, some people die when these hurricanes happen. And we're starting to see this increase of these events. And I think that one of the main concerns is probably we're seeing this this shifting baseline syndrome. We see these extreme weather events all the time in the news that we almost become desensitized to them. So they become normal, but actually they're still not normal, that we're getting this 1 in 100 year, 1 in 1,000 year flood happening more and more regularly, and people start to go, oh, okay, this is just kind of another one of these.
Okay, yeah, for sure. Yeah. Normal in respect to the past few thousand years is what was in that 1 degree band where it's been nicely steady almost.
Yes, but because we see it in the news every week now, our statistical ability doesn't, humans aren't very good at kind of thinking on these long time scales. I think that's a cool thing about geology, is it allows us to go back in time and understand some of this, and gives us a bit of context for what's happening today.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the timescales we're talking about here, the Holocene, is just a flash of a second in terms of geological time anyway, isn't it?
Yeah, well, exactly, yeah.
That's less than that whole 24-hour clock, and humans didn't come onto Earth until 11:58 and 11:59 and 58 seconds. So 2 seconds before midnight, humans came onto Earth, and the Holocene is what even that is 1/10 of a second before midnight, isn't it?
Yeah.
24-hour day. Amazing.
And I think it's funny because a lot of my work is focused only on the last, mostly only in the last few million years, but I mean sometimes going back to say the Miocene, 15 million years ago. But again, even the Miocene's a very relatively recent geological period compared to deep time and what a lot of other geologists would study.
Of course. Isn't it true technically we're still in an ice age because there's ice at the poles?
So the general trajectory for the last 30 million years has been cooling. So I don't know if I would say we're in an ice age, but maybe if you looked at deeper time periods, that may be the case. But when South America and the Antarctic Peninsula separated, the Drake Passage opened up, and then the Southern Ocean took in a lot of that heat, which was basically what isolated the South Pole from the rest of the world, which is what allowed the ice caps to form. So that was the formation of Antarctica about 30 million years ago. And then since then, the temperature has been generally cooling. Obviously there's been some warming and cooling, but we're now, because of the CO2 that we've put back into the atmosphere, we're now starting to see CO2 levels we haven't seen for millions of years. And so then the question is, how quickly will temperatures and how quickly will the ice sheet adjust? And what is the sort of safe amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and what is this safe temperature? And so 2 degrees tends to be the magic number.
Yeah.
And keeping below 400 parts per million carbon dioxide is also the kind of the magic CO2 number. What we know from the geological record is when we go over 400 parts per million CO2 into the atmosphere, temperatures tend to be 2 to 3 degrees warmer, and we lose parts of the West Antarctic ice sheet, we lose Greenland. And so that's perhaps, depending who you talk to, some people say we still have a chance and we can bring that back and we can keep these ice sheets. Other people say it's already underway, and we may already be committed to that amount of sea level. Certainly we're committed to about 50 centimetres of sea level rise by the end of the century. Whether or not that's more, that's still not necessarily.
That's a global average.
Yeah. So about 50 centimetres.
Okay.
Yeah, potentially more than a metre though.
Be interesting to see how that will, which areas get more disrupted and which areas stay. Obviously, New Zealand's not so great as we've established, but maybe some areas in the equator were more affected than areas in Northern Hemisphere.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge for a lot of the Pacific Islands too is they don't have mountains, so potentially some of these islands will get completely engulfed, and this is a very real challenge for some of these small island nations. Yeah,
of course. Well, Jake, I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on the podcast. And any thing you want to plug before you set sail?
No, thanks Jack, appreciate it. That was really fun.
Cheers, enjoyable, wasn't it? Cheers, mate. Thank you.